Have you ever seen a person being hastily judged by the world just because they are too young, not enough, not worthy? Mara Hensley once stood at the door of a new life, placing all her hopes on a journey to find a home. But the moment she reached the thing she most expected, she was rejected in a calm and cruel way. In the dusty, cold, and lonely West, Mara is forced to face a heartbreaking choice: return to a lost past, or stand firm in an unwelcoming land. If that were you at an age where you've suffered enough loss, known what it's like to be misunderstood, known what it's like to have people look at you as if you weren't even human, what would you do? Would you have the courage to start over, even if no one believed in you? And can a broken soul meet a heart that sees deeper than the surface? We invite you to step into a healing story, light, yet profound, a journey that perhaps all of us, especially those who have gone through many windy seasons, can find ourselves in. If you love humane stories, please like, share, subscribe to the channel to start this journey with me. That morning, the western sky opened with a pale pink left from the edge of dawn. The wind blew in gentle gusts, carrying the scent of dry, wild grass and rotting wood from the fences that stretched as far as the eye could see. The train from the south scraped its wheels on the steel rails, kicking up a fine mist of dust. As the train whistle blew one last time and slowly came to a stop, everyone in the town of Dry Creek Ridge began to turn their eyes toward the train doors. They don't often have new customers, especially not this early. The doors opened. A young woman stepped down the steps, her leather shoes worn but polished. Mara Hensley clutched a canvas bag to her chest, the only thing she had with her after a 1,000-mile journey. Her clay-colored ankle-length dress was slightly frayed at the hem, but every stitch was carefully done. A wide-brimmed hat hid half her face, leaving only her dark brown eyes, visible eyes that made it difficult to tell whether she was frightened or simply unusually calm. People stood on the porches of taverns, grocery stores, or leaned against the fences of the post office, watching her with curious and wary eyes. Rumors spread faster than the wind. The mail-order bride is in town. Some older men whispered, some women frowned as if they did not believe that such a young face could be the wife of a rancher. Mara stood still for a moment, then straightened her hat. She knew the town would look at her that way. She knew it before she left the train station in Amarillo. But seeing it with her own eyes still broke her heart. She didn't blame any. The West was used to pragmatism. They had seen too many young people swallowed up by this land. A man's voice rang out from the right. "Miss Hensley." Mara turned. A tall man in his 40s wearing a black cowboy hat and a neat plaid shirt stood a few feet away from her. His face was square, his pale blue eyes unreadable. This was Howard Ellington, the man who had written to her through a matchmaker, asking her to marry him. Mara nodded. "Yes, it's me." Howard looked her up and down, but it wasn't the loving, expectant look of a man about to pick up a bride. It was more like the look of a rancher assessing an item of clothing for suitability. After a few seconds, he let out a soft, almost unheard sigh. "I was a little surprised." Mara tightened her grip on her bag. "Because I arrived earlier than expected." Howard shook his head. "No. Because you're too young." The sentence fell on the deserted platform like a heavy stone. The people standing nearby turned around involuntarily, pretending not to notice but still listening. Mara felt her heart slow as if to make sure she heard correctly. Howard continued, "I need a woman who has been through life. Someone who knows how to manage a farm, how to manage a home, how to treat people in this area. You," he paused as if searching for words that weren't too harsh. "You look more like a girl fresh out of girls' school." The air was heavy. Mara took a deep breath. She was not one to cry easily. She had cared for her father for the last 3 years of his life, seen him sick, seen him suffer through snowy nights, when she had to keep the stove going all night to keep him alive. She had cleaned the house, done everything herself since she was 17. No one but she knew. But her mature face could not erase her natural youthfulness. "I understand," Mara replied softly, her voice not trembling. Howard looked around. The eyes of the town seemed to be upon them. He didn't want to make a scene. His reputation was important. So he pulled an envelope from his pocket. "Here's your fare. Consider it compensation for the inconvenience. I don't think you should stay at Dry Creek Ridge. This isn't an easy place to live." Mara took the envelope but did not open it. She was grateful that at least he did not turn and leave without a word. But in that moment, she felt as if something in her heart had stopped. Not because she was disappointed in the relationship. There had never been any feelings between them. But because she understood that this meant she had nowhere else to go. Howard nodded awkwardly, then turned his back to the horse, tied to a nearby post. Before mounting, he said only one short sentence, "Good luck." No one said anything more. Howard rode off the sand, trailing behind him like a thin cloud of smoke, leaving Mara standing alone in the middle of the platform. A breeze blew, making her skirts flutter. Mara stood still, watching Howard until he was out of sight. The townspeople began to disperse. Some looked at her with pity. Others shrugged as if rejected brides were not uncommon in the West. Mara bowed her head slightly, took a breath, and stepped off the platform. No hurry, no faltering. Just slow, steady steps, like someone reminding herself that even if she was rejected, she could still stand tall and keep going. In my mind, a small but painful question rang out. Was I wrong to hope for a new start in this place? But then the familiar strong nature rose again. No, I've come this far. I won't turn back just because of a rejection. Mara looked up at the western mountains. Their crimson peaks reflected the early morning light. It was a majestic, sad, yet breathtakingly beautiful sight. She told herself, if this land challenges me, then I will respond with all the life I have left. Then she headed straight for town, where the red dirt roads awaited her exploration, where things would get tough, and where she would find something bigger than rejection, a place, a person, that she never knew, was gradually entering her life. Mara entered the town of Dry Creek Ridge on a cool, breezy morning, but her heart was as heavy as a winter afternoon. Cracked red dirt roads wound between rows of low wooden houses. Grocery store windows shook slightly in the wind. On the terrace of the tavern, several older men drank early coffee, looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and intrigue. She didn't blame them. A young woman traveling alone, dragging an old canvas bag with no guarantees. In the West, that was always something others had to be wary of. Mara walked slowly, trying to keep calm. Every step reminded her that she had nowhere to go. The money Mr. Howard gave her will probably only be enough for a few meals and a place to sleep, she told herself. Since her father died, she had almost no family left, so going back was no longer an option. She raised her head and saw a wooden sign hanging in front of a ground-floor building, Dry Creek Boarding House. She was about to enter when a woman's voice called out from the opposite porch, "Little girl, that inn has no rooms left today." Mara turned around. A stocky woman in her 50s, with gray hair tied back in a bun, was standing in front of the fabric shop. She looked at Mara with a matter-of-fact but not harsh gaze. "Are you looking for someone you know?" she asked. Mara shook her head. "No, I just arrived this morning." She nodded, as if she had guessed something. "My name is Nora Tillman." "You came here alone. Something must have happened on the road." In the West, people who travel alone are usually running from something or looking for something bigger. Mara wanted to reply that she was just looking for a decent life, a place to start over. But her throat was tight. "I just need a place to sleep." Nora was kind, but her eyes still held the wariness that had become instinctive for frontier women. "That's difficult," said Nora. "The main inn is full. The tavern is not for a girl like you." A cold wind blew, causing Mara to tighten the thin scarf around her shoulders. Mrs. Nora glanced at her as if struggling with her own thoughts, then said, "There is one more place, but it is a bit unusual." "Have you heard of Dead Horse Livery?" Mara shook her head. Nora pointed to the end of the street. "That's where people leave their horses, carts, and heavy things. But the livery owner, Mr. Caleb Ward, sometimes lets people in need sleep in the spare room at the back." Livery. Mara never thought that one day she would have to ask to sleep next to the stables. Mrs. Nora saw her wavering eyes and added, "Don't worry. Mr. Caleb is a decent man. Quiet, very quiet, but kind. Although he has a rather heavy past." That made Mara a little nervous. "How heavy?" Nora was silent for a few seconds, then sighed. "He was a cavalryman. Then He lost his wife in a fire. He lived alone ever since. No one knew much about his life, but the whole town believed he had done nothing wrong with women. It was just, he lived as a night watchman, very isolated. Hearing this, Mara felt somewhat relieved. In the West, the quiet ones were often the ones who suffered the most. "You should go there and ask," said Nora. "If he won't take it, I'll think of something else." Mara nodded gratefully. "Thank you. Just call me Nora." "And what's your name, Mara?" "Mara Hensley." Mrs. Nora smiled. "Nice name. Go, the sun is getting hot." The road to Dead Horse Livery wound through less populated areas where the wind picked up and the scent of horses wafted through the air. A strange feeling of anxiety and hope crept into her stomach. The dark wooden sign, hanging in front of the livery, rattled in the wind. The large door was ajar. It was darker inside, but sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wood, creating warm streaks of yellow light. Mara stepped in and called softly, "Is anyone here?" The hammering stopped. A large figure appeared behind the stables. He stood still for a few seconds, letting his eyes adjust to the light before stepping out. He was a middle-aged man, about 45, with broad shoulders, a dusty brown shirt, and jeans faded by time. His face was gaunt but clearly defined, his black hair streaked with silver, and his eyes were deep gray. His gaze reminded one of a cold lake in the middle of a mountain range. Calm, with few ripples, but with something very tired in it. "Are you Caleb Ward?" Mara asked softly. He stood still for a few seconds and then nodded. "What do you need?" His voice was low and hoarse, as if it had not been used for days. Not the voice of someone who was annoyed, just the voice of someone who was used to silence. Mara took a deep breath. I'm looking for a place to stay. Just for a few days. They say you have a spare room in the back." Caleb looked at her, not surprised, not curious. He just observed for a long time. In the West, you had to judge whether the person you were talking to posed a threat. Suddenly Mara felt like he saw everything she tried to hide. The tiredness, the hurt, and the loneliness of being rejected the moment she arrived. Finally, Caleb said, "The room is not big. The walls are thin. At night you can hear the sound of horses turning over. I don't mind. There is no bed. I can sleep with a blanket." Caleb continued to look at her. His gaze was not unfriendly, just unreadable, as if he were no longer used to the feeling of being needed. "Are you alone?" "Yes." Silence for a few seconds. Then he nodded slightly. "Okay, follow me." Mara sighed in relief, but kept her composure. She followed him into the small room behind the livery. It was plain, with wooden walls, a low shelf, and a small window that looked out onto the pasture. But it was clean. There was no unpleasant smell except the pleasant scent of hay. "You can stay here. The first 3 days are free." Mara was surprised. "I didn't want to bother you." Caleb shook his head. "No problem." Then he turned away, as if afraid that if he stayed, he would have to say more than he was used to. Mara watched his back, firm, but lonely, as if he had lived for years just to escape memory. But as he passed through the door, the light enveloped his figure, giving Mara a glimpse of what others might not. Behind that silence is a person who has suffered too much, but still maintains kindness. And she understood. She wasn't the only one in this town with invisible wounds. When Caleb returned to the stables, Mara put down her bag and sat on the shelf. She looked at the old wall, then closed her eyes. A question arose in my mind: can I survive in this place? Then, like another gentler wave, she replied, in her own thoughts, "I've been through worse. Dry Creek Ridge is just the next challenge." Outside, the horses trotted softly into the stables. The wind whistled through the tin roof. Caleb's hammer pounded steadily. All combined to create the familiar sound of the West, rough, lonely but warm, if the listener is patient enough. And in that sound, for the first time since arriving at Dry Creek Ridge, Mara felt not quite alone. The first evening at Dead Horse Livery passed slowly, like a long winter night on the frontier. The oil lamp hanging on the wall cast a soft yellow light, illuminating the old woodwork, but not making the room feel less lonely. Mara sat on a thin blanket, her legs drawn up under her frayed skirt, her back against the wooden wall. Outside, the sound of horses turning and hooves lightly tapping against the bars of the stables echoed through the darkness like a whisper. She had never slept in a livery before, but, strangely enough, The roughness of it felt safer than the luxurious but unfamiliar inn. Maybe because here, everything was real. No one pretended, no one judged, no one accused her of things they never knew. A light knock sounded. Mara started, her heart beating fast. The door opened softly. Caleb stood outside, a small lamp in one hand and the other twisting the cap of a metal water jug. "I brought you some water," he said, his voice low and short. Mara nodded her thanks. Caleb placed the pitcher in the corner of the room, his eyes observing, not prying. He was a man of strong principles. He did not invade other people's space, but he still maintained his own kind duties. "Are you warm enough?" Caleb asked. "Yes," Mara replied. "This room is better than I expected." Caleb nodded slightly, his gray eyes softening somewhat. "If anything, you can call me. I was up most of the night." She blinked. "You were up all night." He looked out into the darkness of the livery, his shoulders slumped a little, not tired but heavy. "I sleep little." A pause. "It has been so for years." Mara did not ask further, but she could sense that it was not habit but the result of a pain as deep as a ravine. The pain of Westerners is rarely expressed in words. Caleb touched his hat and stepped out. The door closed, but his presence lingered in the room, like the warmth left behind by a small fire. Night fell. Mara lay on her side, looking out the small window at the deep blue sky of Dry Creek Ridge. Thousands of stars twinkled like silver ashes on velvet. She had looked at the sky in many places, Kansas, Wyoming, Colorado, but rarely had she felt like the sky was looking back at her. A light neigh, then silence. Mara turned over, trying to sleep, but her mind flashed back to Mr. Howard, his face, as he had said no. How he had avoided her gaze as if he knew his decision had not been entirely fair. "You are too young. You are not experienced enough. The farm is difficult. I need an older woman." Those words, though light, still cut into her heart like an old but not rusty knife. She closed her eyes, but tears still flowed silently, not because of losing the chance to be a wife, but because of the feeling of once again being seen as not good enough, not worthy enough for anyone to put their trust in long term. The next morning Mara was awakened by the sound of light footsteps. She sat up, adjusted her shawl, and opened the door. Caleb was cleaning the stables, his shovel rhythmically raking layers of old straw. His shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing the muscular arms of years of manual labor. Sweat beaded on his temples, but he kept working. When he saw her, he just nodded in greeting. Mara walked over to the low fence that separated the pen from the path. "Can I help?" Caleb looked up, slightly surprised. "No need. This is heavy. I used to work on a farm. I'm stronger than I look." Caleb raised his eyebrows slightly, as if he had heard that line from someone in the past, and the memory softened his gaze. "If you want, you can sweep that yard." He pointed to the broom leaning against the wall. Mara smiled and took the broom, starting to work. It was a strange but pleasant morning. The two of them worked in a natural silence, not forced, not forced. Each rake, each sweep, blended together like a wordless conversation. Every now and then Mara glanced at Caleb. He worked carefully, without sloppiness or haste. The man looked more like a carpenter than a cavalryman. But there was something in his stance, the quiet alertness in his shoulders, the look in his eyes that said he had seen things no one should see. Late in the morning, Caleb stopped to wash his hands in the trough. "You did well," he said. "I'm used to working." Caleb looked at her for a few seconds, then asked, "Are you coming to Dry Creek Ridge to look for work?" Even though she knew he would ask, Mara still lowered her voice slightly. "I am looking for a new start." Caleb didn't ask further, but Mara knew he understood what she was getting at. A moment later he said, "Nora asked me to ask you. She needs help at the fabric shop this afternoon. Would you like to come over and try it on?" Mara was surprised. "I would love to." "Good. I'll take you there." "No need. I can go by myself." Caleb looked out onto the street where carriages and groups of men stood talking. "This town is small, but not everyone is friendly to newcomers. I'll come along." There was no pomp in his words, just the truth and responsibility he took upon himself, even though no one asked. Mara nodded slightly. That afternoon, when Caleb took Mara to the fabric shop, the surrounding eyes were no longer just curious. A few older men nodded to Caleb, then looked at Mara as if trying to piece together some story in their heads. Western towns are always like that. They look, they guess, but rarely speak. Mrs. Nora welcomed Mara with a gentle smile. "Good, you're here. Come in and help me sort the fabrics." She glanced at Caleb. "Good man. I'm sure you can bring her." Caleb simply replied, "I'll be back to pick her up before dark." Mara turned to look at him. There was something about that simple promise that made her heart sink, the certainty she had been missing. By evening, true to his word, Caleb returned. "Are you doing well?" he asked as they walked up the dirt road toward the livery. "Very good," Mara smiled. "Thanks for bringing me here." Caleb was silent for a moment, then said, "You don't owe anyone anything. I just did what I had to do. It's just—" "Few people are so nice to me," Mara said softly. Caleb slowed his steps. A gray cloud passed over his eyes, the cloud of years of loneliness, of a heart once torn in two. "I am not a good man," he said softly. "I am only trying to live better than my old mistakes." The words made Mara pause. He spoke as if he were confessing more to himself than to her. She wanted to ask him what he had done wrong, but her intuition told her to wait. Some pain needed to be opened up by the person involved. It couldn't be forced. When they reached the livery, the sky was purple. The small room was lit by an oil lamp. Caleb stood in the door, his hands on the wooden frame. "Are you okay?" Mara nodded slightly. "Better than I thought." He nodded, then turned away. But before he stepped into the darkness, he paused for a second. "If anyone in town bothers you, tell me." Not a promise, a commitment. The door closed, leaving Mara alone with the strange warmth lingering in the air. She sat down and looked out through the small window. The night wind was still cold, but something in her internal organs had warmed up. For the first time she thought, maybe this is where I can really start over. Not with a hasty marriage, but with real connections, real people. And the most genuine person in this town is the one who talks the least. Mornings at Dry Creek Ridge always began strangely quiet. So quiet that you could hear the windmills creaking at the end of town or a dog barking from a distant farm. For Mara, the most pleasant sounds were Caleb's tapping as he paced around the livery, or the horses breathing like warm air on a dry morning. When Mara stepped out of her room today, the early morning sunlight made the dust particles floating in the air look like tiny petals in flight. Caleb stood next to the largest stable, his hand resting on the muzzle of the powerful black horse, his eyes as calm as ever. "You're up early," he said softly, not turning around but knowing she was there. "I'm used to it," Mara replied. "I used to get up before dawn ever since I was taking care of my father." Caleb nodded, still not looking directly at her. Mara's words always made him pause, as if they touched a place in his memory. "Do you want to work at the fabric shop today?" he asked. "Yes. Mrs. Nora told me to come in the morning to learn how to sort fabrics." Caleb thought for a few seconds and said, "I'll take you there. I'll be back at noon." The rhythm was familiar. He spoke not as if he were controlling, but as if he were making sure she was safe. And though he didn't say it, Mara could tell Caleb was noticing every change around her. As she prepared to leave the livery, Caleb retied the black horse's bridle and said, "Ride." "I'll walk. The road is still dusty. I ride this one," he nodded. "Her name is Midnight. She is gentle. She won't hurt you." Mara mounted easily, though she hadn't ridden in months. The moment made Caleb look at her a second longer. She was young, slender, but not fragile. He watched the way she held the reins, the way she held her back straight like someone who had been doing this all her life. And for the first time there was a different light in his eyes, a recognition, however slight, that she wasn't the fragile person the town thought she was. At the fabric shop, Nora received Mara with a satisfied nod. "This girl makes me less annoyed with difficult customers." "She listens better than my husband did when he was alive," Nora added, making Mara chuckle. Caleb stood there for a few seconds, and then said softly, "I'll come back to pick you up." They didn't say goodbye, but Mara watched him go, and she realized she had begun to wish he were near. That afternoon, as Mara was stacking rolls of dark blue cotton fabric on a shelf, a whisper made her pause slightly. Two elderly women stood near the window, speaking loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "That's the mail-order bride that was returned. I heard Howard Ellington said she was too young. What kind of farm can someone that young keep? The words were soft but sharp as a knife. Mara continued folding the cloth, but her hands trembled slightly. Though she tried to be strong, the wound had not healed. Nora saw it and immediately said loudly, "If anyone in town has ever been wrongly judged, they should keep quiet and let the girl do her work." The two women blushed and backed away. Mara thanked her with her eyes. But in my heart, a small piece of sadness falls down, gently but not easily removed. When Caleb returned that afternoon, he could tell something was wrong with Mara. No one spoke, but the unspoken look in her eyes often spoke louder than words. "Are you tired?" he asked. "No, just a little headache." Caleb didn't believe it, but he didn't press. Instead, he said, "Let's take a detour back. I want to show you something." Mara was surprised, but followed. They turned onto a less traveled road that led to the edge of town, where there was a low field with a single birch tree standing alone. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. Caleb looked toward the horizon, where the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the barren land. "This is where my wife likes to sit," he said softly. "She says, the world is quieter here." Mara was silent. Caleb continued, "When she died, I stopped coming here. I couldn't bear it." Then he turned to look at Mara. "But today, I think you need the silence just like I did." Mara squeezed the towel lightly in her hand. That's when she saw the real man inside, Caleb Wardnot, the taciturn livery owner, or the man who stood alone in the shadows. But a man who loved deeply, lost almost everything, and lived the rest of his life with respect for the deceased. She took a deep breath. "Thank you for telling me this." Caleb nodded, his eyes on the setting sun. In that moment the two of them stood still, not speaking, not looking at each other, but the silence connected them in a way words could not. A light wind blew from the west, making Mara's hat flutter. She held it, then looked down at the ground, thinking, "He took me to the place that had been most important to him." It wasn't the act of someone who was distant, or someone who was just being nice out of courtesy. It was a sign that he was opening a door he had kept closed. She felt her heart warm. On the way back, the sky began to darken. A blue-purple hue covered the town, and a few oil lamps came on earlier than usual. Caleb walked beside Mara, not too close, not too far. But his presence was enough to make her feel at peace. "Mr. Caleb," Mara hesitated. "I thank you for today." He did not turn around, just said softly, "We all lose something. But sometimes, silence is the only way to keep what remains." Mara looked at him for a long time, and in that moment she understood that this man of few words from the West had just taught her the first thing about healing. Not to forget the pain, but to learn to live with it and still move on. When they reached the livery, the light of the oil lamp shone through the cracks in the wood. Caleb stopped at the door and said, "You should go to bed early. I have work at the farm tomorrow. If you want, I can take you with me." Mara smiled for the first time all day. "I really want to." Caleb nodded. "Tomorrow then." He walked away, but Mara stopped and stared after him. Not the look of someone in love, but the look of someone beginning to find her place in a place that seemed destined to reject her. A feeling suddenly arose in her heart. Maybe he was the first person in Dry Creek Ridge to truly see her. And as she turned back into the room, placing her hand on the warm wooden wall, her heart felt as light as the wind. Sometimes a person's silence speaks the loudest. The next day opened with the clear blue of Dry Creek Ridge. No clouds, no signs of anything. The sky was as wide as a pale blue. Someone had just shaken off the dust. Mara emerged from her room, combing her long hair and wrapping her frayed scarf around it. She wasn't yet used to the feeling of having a temporary shelter, but the familiar sound of the wind blowing through the livery helped her breathe easier. Caleb stood in the yard, tightening midnight's reins, glancing instinctively toward her door. He didn't say, "Good morning," but his slight nod was enough to let Mara know he noticed her presence, and that made her feel less like a shadow in a strange town. "Are you ready?" Caleb asked softly. "Ready," Mara replied, smoothing her skirt. "I need to go to Silas Boone's farm today. I'm doing some work for him on the fence and driveway. If you want, I can take you. It won't be too much trouble." Mara nodded immediately. "I would like to. I can't be much help in town." Caleb paused, his eyes looking at her as if considering something. You can help more than you think." She had no idea what he was talking about, but the words touched her somewhere, a place no one had touched in a long time. They set off in silence, following the dirt road that led north into the hills. The morning sun shone through the fine dust, making the landscape shimmer with a pale silver. When they reached the soft sand, Caleb slowed his horse. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Very well," Mara replied softly. "If there is anything, just say it." His voice was low and resolute, as if he were defending something he didn't fully understand. Mara was grateful for the concern, but at the same time she felt her heart shrink a little. She wasn't used to having someone care for her after so many years of relying on herself. The road opened up, and Silas Boone's farm appeared in the distance. A large gray-brown log house surrounded by a long fence that ran along the hillside. Behind the house were rolling pastures where the wind blew the autumn's golden hair into soft strands. When they arrived, a boy of about 10 stood on the porch. He wore an old shirt and short jeans, but his eyes were brighter than many children his age. He looked at them, then ran toward Mara with a naturalness that surprised her. "Are you from the livery?" he asked immediately. Mara smiled slightly. "I am Mara. I'm Evan Boone," he introduced confidently. "Dad said Caleb was coming over to help fix the fence today." Caleb nodded. "Didn't you tell your dad not to run out into the street like this?" Evan smiled slyly. "I remember. But I want to know who you are. You are different from the people in town." Mara was a little surprised. "How is it different? I don't look at you like those other people. No pity. No fake smile. It's like I understand you." The child's words made Mara pause. She knew the feeling all too well of being seen as someone who needed saving or as something strange to be observed from a distance. Caleb watched them both silently. Evan rarely spoke so much. It made his eyes soften slightly, as if a glimmer of hope had crept into the darkness. Silas Boone emerged from behind the house. He was tall and broad-shouldered like Caleb, but his gait was quicker and more determined. The widower had a reputation for being quiet, but his face was warmer than Mara had expected, less reserved, less dark. "Caleb, you're here," Silas nodded to his friend, then turned to Mara. "And this is the new girl in town," Caleb briefly introduced. "She's staying at the livery for a few days. I'm taking you with me." Silas looked at Mara, not judging, not overly curious. His gaze was that of someone who had met many new people and had learned not to judge too quickly. "You are welcome here," Silas said slowly. Evan tugged on Mara's sleeve. "Do you want to see where I play? There's a bird's nest I just found." Caleb started to say something, but stopped. Mara looked at him questioningly. "Okay," Caleb said, his voice soft, but there was something in his eyes that looked like protection, and unspoken protection. Mara followed Evan to the large tree behind the house. He pointed to a low branch where a small bird's nest lay among the yellow leaves. A baby bird had just poked its head out. It was small and trembling, but its eyes were round and hopeful. "See," Evan said, his voice full of excitement. "It's weak, but it still wants to fly." Mara looked at it for a long time. "I understand," she said softly. "There are things that seem weak, but are the strongest." The boy looked up, his eyes shining. "You too." The unexpected question made Mara choke for a moment. "I was just trying, Evan." Evan smiled, a very real, very clear smile. Meanwhile, Caleb and Silas repaired the wind-damaged section of the fence. They worked without much word, the way Western men do. Silas glanced at Mara, then at Caleb. "Is that girl?" "Okay," Caleb simply said. "She was rejected." Silas nodded slightly, as if understanding the story without hearing the rest. "Because she was too young." "Yeah," Caleb replied, his voice low and dry. "But she's strong. Stronger than many people think." Silas put down his hammer and crossed his arms. "This town sometimes looks at people through the dust on their shoes, not their eyes." Caleb turned to Silas. "Where are you looking?" Silas looked into the distance. "I watch what they do when no one is looking." When he finished, they both turned to look at Mara. She was sitting next to Evan, listening patiently to his story, her eyes as calm as water. Caleb squeezed the hand holding the hammer lightly, as if something had quietly shifted inside him. In the afternoon, as they were preparing to return, Evan ran after Mara. "Will you come back?" he asked, his voice regretful. Mara smiled and bowed. "If allowed, she will come back," Caleb replied. She will come back. Silas looked at both of them, his eyes warmer than usual. My door is always open. On the way back, as the afternoon light stretched their shadows to the ground, Mara whispered, Evan is a very good boy. Caleb nodded. He looks like his mother, kind, but she died early. I don't think Silas ever really recovered. Mara looked at him. Like you, Caleb was silent. A heavy, soft silence like the darkness of the evening sky. He did not answer, but that silence spoke more to Mara than any confession. That night, when Mara returned to her room, she sat by the window and looked out into the darkness. She thought about Caleb, about Silas, about Evan. She suddenly understood that there are many types of loneliness, but there are also many types of healing, and sometimes it starts with very thin, very light threads of connection, but enough to keep the heart from falling into the abyss alone. Outside, the horse's footsteps sounded softly against the bars of the stable. The wind blew through the tin roof. And Mara knew, tomorrow her life on Dry Creek Ridge would take a new turn, though she had no idea where it would lead her. The wind blew harder that afternoon than usual. It carried the scent of sand from the northern hills, whipping the livery roof with a foreboding waft. Mara stood in the doorway, her old shawl pulled tight, her eyes fixed on the horizon where she had left Caleb that morning. She felt uneasy, as if something was about to happen. Caleb led Midnight into the cage, his movements slow but somewhat tense. The wind changed direction today, he said, his voice low. When the wind blows from the canyon, it's usually not a good thing. Mara looked at him, a little worried. Is something going to happen? The ground there is prone to landslides, and children often play in that area. Silas told Evan to stay away. But children are difficult to keep. As soon as he finished speaking, Mara felt her heart tighten. Not because of some vague fear, but because she suddenly thought of Evan's eyes, bright as the morning sun, but with a hint of loneliness hidden deep beneath. Lonely children often seek out solitude, where they feel they are not bothering anyone, nor are they being watched in their sadness. She understood that better than anyone. Late in the afternoon, as they were stacking some hay bins in the livery, the sound of hurried hooves rang out in the distance. Mara and Caleb both turned. A young man riding toward them from the direction of the Boone Ranch, his face red from the wind and anxious. Mr. Caleb, he called out. Caleb stepped out without hesitation. What's the matter, little Evan? He's not home. Silas looked everywhere but couldn't find him. Someone said he went towards the canyon at noon. It was as if someone had given Mara a hard blow in the heart. She didn't think just reflexively, I'll go with you. Caleb turned to look at her. His eyes flashed with surprise, then quickly turned to his familiar determination. You stay. No, Mara took a step forward. Evan trusts me. If he's scared, he'll listen to me. Caleb tightened his grip on the saddle strap. He didn't want her to be in danger, but part of him knew she was right. A child's greatest fear wasn't the dark or heights. It was being left alone. And Mara somehow made the children not feel alone. Caleb looked her straight in the eye. Okay, but you have to stay behind me. Not a step away, I promise. That's it. No further words needed. Caleb mounted as if born to ride a horse. Mara mounted Midnight behind, clinging to the saddle as she galloped along. The wind whipped at their faces. Dust swirled in the dry dirt road. The sun was low, its rays slanting over the red mountains. As they approached the canyon, Caleb signaled a halt. The wind was stronger here. Whirlwinds whipped up the fine sand in coils like tiny snakes. Caleb called out, his voice blown back by the wind. Mara also called, Evan, where are you? There was no answer. Only the wind whistling through the rocks. Caleb led the horse to the edge of the canyon. Mara dismounted first, running toward a fresh dirt trail. Mr. Caleb, she pointed down. There are footprints. Of a child. Caleb stepped forward. He looked at the footprints, then down a small slope leading to a wider ledge. He gritted his teeth. If the boy goes down there, he could get stuck. A faint echo came from below. Very faint. But Mara heard. Mr. Caleb, I heard you, Caleb, immediately started down the slope. Mara followed, not letting him go alone. The gravel slipped under her feet, but she clung to the cliff and continued down. They reached the low ledge and found Evan sitting against a large boulder. One leg was caught under a dead branch. His pants were torn, and there were long scratches on his legs. His face was pale. When he saw Mara, his eyes widened. "Miss Mara." She ran over, knelt down, and hugged him. "You're okay. I'm here. It's okay." Caleb bent down and removed the branch from the boy's leg. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" Evan shook his head, but his lips trembled. "I am sorry. I just wanted to see the baby birds. I didn't think the wind would be that strong." Caleb took a deep breath, as if trying to contain the emotions that had just risen. "It's not your fault," he said, surprisingly softly. "As long as you're okay." Mara hugged Evan closer, a natural reflex she hadn't done with any child since her father died. She realized her heart was trembling not because of the cold wind, but because she knew in that moment the boy believed her completely. A trust that she never thought she would have again with someone. As Caleb lifted Evan onto Midnight's back, Mara walked beside him, holding his hand. Evan leaned his head on her shoulder, his breathing labored but calm. "Miss Mara, you really came," Evan whispered. "I promise," she replied, smiling slightly. In that moment, as the purple sky fell over them, Caleb looked at the two of them, a strong-willed young woman and a lonely, newly found boy, and in the silence he sensed something was changing. Not the wind, not the earth or sky, but himself. When he reached the Boone farm, Silas rushed out, his face so tense with worry that he almost collapsed. When he saw Evan, his knees almost gave out. He hugged his son and patted his back. "Son, oh my son." Evan hugged his father back, but his eyes remained on Mara. "Dad, Mara is looking for me." Silas looked up, his eyes red but his gaze warm as fire. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked but firm. Caleb stood behind Mara, saying nothing. But Silas gave him a look, the look of two men who had lost too much and understood each other without words. In that look, Caleb saw something he didn't want to name. When they left the farm and headed back to town, darkness had settled over most of the sky. The drive back to the livery was strangely silent, not the silence of empty space, but the silence of something growing being acknowledged between the two of them. Mara walked beside Caleb, her boots crunching in the soft dirt. She glanced at him. "Today, I'm really scared," she whispered. Caleb didn't look at her, but his steps slowed a little. "Me too." That confession, coming from the quietest man in town, made Mara feel warmth spreading from the deepest part of her chest. "Do you think Evan will be okay?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "He's strong, like his father, and like you." She looked at him, smiling slightly at his strange yet sincere words. "I'm not as strong as you think. You are stronger than you think." A light breeze blew by, blowing her hair aside. In that moment, Mara felt Caleb's eyes look deeper, longer, as if he had noticed something in her he had never allowed himself to see. Then he turned away, afraid to reveal it too clearly. But she saw it. When they reached the livery, Caleb stopped at the door. He spoke low, but his voice was as firm as the West Country. "Thank you for not abandoning the boy. I would never do that." "I know," he replied. "That's why I let you come along." Mara stood still for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. She realized that the silence of the man before her, the silence that many people misunderstood, was actually his most genuine language. A language she began to understand. 3 days after the canyon incident, the town of Dry Creek Ridge began to buzz with new stories. News of Mara's plunge into dangerous terrain to rescue Evan spread faster than the desert wind. People whispered it in the tavern, in the grocery store, at the water pump, even on the porch of the church. In a town where everyone knows everyone, the fact that a girl who is too young, too fragile, dares to do something that not every man dares to do, makes many people reconsider their judgments. That morning, as Mara walked to the fabric shop, a few people standing in front of the grocery store stopped talking to look at her. Their gazes were no longer cold, nor did they contain any pity. A little curious, a little awed, and something more, reserved but kind. An old lady about 70 nodded to her. "Miss, it's a beautiful day today." Mara smiled back. It was only a greeting, but in this skeptical western town, even a nod was a sign of change. In the fabric shop, Nora Tillman was sorting through rolls of newly arrived fabric. She looked up when Mara entered and immediately recognized something. "Little girl, your face is brighter than usual." Mara smiled slightly. "Maybe it's because the wind blew some dust off my heart." Nora looked at her and laughed. "You talk like someone who has lived in the West for a long time. Dry Creek Ridge will be yours in a few years. Belonging does not mean possessing, it means being accepted, being considered a part of this land." Mara knew that, and something warmed her heart. That afternoon, as she was cutting, there was a knock on the door. Caleb stood outside the sunlight behind him, making pale gold lines around his broad shoulders. He was as quiet as ever, but his eyes were different, softer, as if Evan's safety had lifted a heavy stone from his heart. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I need 5 minutes," Mara replied, then turned to Nora to finish cleaning up. Nora smiled and whispered, "He came to pick you up as if he were taking the pastor's daughter home from church." Mara blushed and shook her head. But Nora saw something that Mara herself wasn't fully aware of. On the way back to the livery, the wind was light and the sun was not too harsh. They walked side by side on the dirt road. There was no need to say much. There was a familiar peace between them, as if silence was where they understood each other best. "How is Evan?" Mara asked. "Much better," Caleb replied. "Silas said he was just bruised. But he kept asking me." Mara chuckled. "Really?" "Yes. It said, you were the reason it wasn't afraid of the dark back then." Caleb's voice dropped a little, as if he too was struggling with something unnameable. "Thanks for saving it," he added. Mara looked at him longer than usual. "You don't have to keep thanking me like that." Caleb looked at the horizon, slightly turned away as if to hide his emotions. "It's not that I thank you for saving him. I thank you because you came at the right time." His words were simple but had a lasting aftertaste. Mara suddenly felt a pang in her chest. Not pain, but a strange feeling like the warm wind of early spring touching a place that had been cold for many years. That afternoon, as Caleb was loading hay into the livery, people started stopping by, not to talk about horses, but to ask about Mara. Mrs. Lyon, the bakery owner, hesitated. "This Mr. Caleb, that girl, how long has she lived here?" Caleb paused, his eyes solemn. "She can stay as long as she wants." The man standing next to Mrs. Lyon narrowed his eyes slightly. "I heard she was the bride that Howard rejected." Caleb turned to look at the man. No words needed. Just a look was enough to make the man take a step back. "People say a lot of things," Caleb said slowly, "but I see her do a lot more than people say." That made them both quiet, then they saluted him and turned away. The respect for Caleb was something no one in town wanted to touch. Mara came out from behind and heard part of the conversation. She stood still, not knowing what to say. Caleb saw her and just nodded. "Never mind. But they will say more," she said softly. "Let them talk," he replied. "They will shut up when they have seen enough." Mara looked at him for a long time, then bowed her head. She thought to herself, perhaps he too had lived through many years with the gossip about his past. That evening, as the sky darkened to ink, Mara sat by her door, holding a cup of warm water. She remembered the days she spent caring for her father, the long nights in the old cabin in Kansas, and learning to be silent about what people thought of her. She thought, "This is not the first time I have been misjudged. But this time, I am not alone." As Caleb walked by, he stopped to look at her. "Aren't you sleeping? I was just thinking," Mara replied. "What do you think?" She looked up. The oil lamplight fell on his face, revealing the harsh but warm features behind the silence. "I was thinking, maybe this place doesn't hate me as much as I thought," she said softly. Caleb sat down on the wooden step beside him, not too close, but close enough for his warmth to radiate. "This town is hard to open up to," he said. "But when they take someone in, they take them in wholeheartedly." Mara smiled gently. "What about you?" Caleb was silent. His eyes were turned to the distant darkness where the horses sighed. After a while he said, "I don't know yet," but his voice was softer than ever before. Mara did not ask further. She understood. This man's pain was like barren soil. Seeds could be planted, but it would take a long time for the first drop of water to be absorbed. And so Mara treasured every word he spoke. Each of his words was a small sign that he was taking a step closer to the world he had once left behind. The night deepened. The wind died down. The smell of hay wafted through the air like a lullaby. Mara looked up at the sky. Caleb looked up too. Between the two of them, no promises were made. There was no rush, but there was a distinct feeling that something was moving, slow as water flowing under ice, but unstoppable. And when Mara returned to her room, gently closing the door, she whispered to herself, "Maybe this place is starting to see me." She didn't know that. Outside in the yard, Caleb was still standing there, watching the door close, his eyes holding on to something that was gradually becoming more important to him, something he dare not name, but cannot deny. The next morning, with a thin dew on the ground in front of the livery, Mara woke with a feeling that the day would bring something different. Not a bad omen, just a slight tremor in his heart, like the touch of a blade of grass against an old wooden door. She got ready earlier than usual and went to the livery to help Caleb clean up. The horses whinnied softly when she entered, as if they were used to her from the evenings Caleb spent with her, brushing her mane and checking her hooves. Caleb was holding a bucket of water in the corner of the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his biceps visible in the morning light. He glanced at her and nodded. "You came early." "A little insomnia," Mara replied. Caleb put the bucket down, then looked at her longer than usual. "Is there something bothering you?" That simple question made Mara pause. Since arriving at Dry Creek Ridge, perhaps no one except Caleb had really wanted to know what she was thinking. And sometimes just having someone to ask warmed her heart in an unusual way. I'm getting used to this place," Mara said, "but there's still something that makes me not quite believe it." Caleb was silent. He didn't rush to answer. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, letting her see that he was actually listening. "You don't have to believe it right away," he said. "Faith takes time. Just like dry soil needs a lot of rain to soften." Mara smiled slightly. His comparisons were always simple but to the point. That fragile peace did not last long. By mid-morning, as Mara helped Caleb hitch up a new horse, the sound of galloping hooves echoed from the main road. A strange man appeared, rough-hewn, his face weathered, his hands clutching the reins. A cloud of dust rose behind him. Caleb glanced over and immediately straightened, his face scrunched up. The man jumped off his horse and threw the reins into Caleb's hands. "My horse needs to be groomed. Do it now." His voice was sharp, heavy, and without any respect. Caleb asked softly, "What kind of test do you want me to do, cut or build a new one?" The man turned to Mara, looking her up and down. The look made her take an involuntary step back. "Is this the girl?" Howard returned, he said, his voice so loud that two nearby assistants looked up. The air was filled with an unpleasant smell. Mara tried to keep calm, but her heart pounded in her chest. She tried to forget that story, that past. But people like him always knew how to reopen scars that she thought had healed. Caleb put his hands on the horse's reins, but his eyes never left the other man. "Do you need a manicure or something?" Caleb asked, his voice lower than usual. "Just asking," the other shrugged. "Everyone in this town knows that. This girl seems to have found a place to cling to." His last sentence was full of hidden meaning. Mara felt a lump in her throat. Before she could say anything, Caleb took a step forward, leaning forward slightly as if by accident, but enough to shield her with his large body. "You should leave women to those who understand," Caleb said, his voice even but cold. "I do my nails, and you stand still and keep your mouth shut. No noise, no threats." But with the authority of a man who has overcome pain that only those who have touched death can understand. The other man narrowed his eyes, but he wasn't foolish enough to challenge Caleb in the middle of town. He let out a snort and turned away, but before he left, he took one last look at Mara. "People here are nasty," he whispered so only she could hear. "Remember that." He left. Only when the sound of hooves had faded did Mara let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Caleb turned to her. "Are you okay?" Mara tried to smile, but her voice trembled slightly. He was partly right. People here are disgusting. Caleb shook his head, his voice firm but soft. "They say that because they don't know you. One day they will know. And you, do you think I'm looking for something to hold on to?" Caleb was taken aback. He looked at her a long time. The look was not hurried, not heated, just deep and real. "I think he said you're looking for a place to stand." Mara had to turn away for the first time in weeks to hide her eyes. The incident seemed over, but it left a thin scar inside Mara. That afternoon, as she sat in her small room, she felt something pulling her back to her old fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of being reminded of the past. Fear that every effort is just a fragile wall. She wondered, was she getting Caleb into trouble? Would this town ever truly accept her? Outside, Caleb's hammering echoed through the livery. The metallic rhythm strangely calmed Mara, as if just hearing it could tell her she wasn't being left behind. And just then there was a soft knock on the door. Caleb stood there, his hands covered in straw. "Would you like to go for a walk?" he asked. "It's not far, just to the back lot. Nice breeze." Mara looked at him. His gaze was not pressing, only inviting, and she nodded. They walked in the fading light. The western sky at sunset was a soft orange, like a silk scarf covering everything with a rare gentleness. After a few minutes of silence, Mara spoke up. "Today reminds me of many things." Caleb slowed down to walk alongside her. What people said before. In Kansas, when my father died, when I decided to go away, everyone thought I was too young. Then, Howard. Caleb didn't ask more about Howard. He respected her silence, as he respected his own truth. "You see," Mara continued, "no matter who I am, people always look at age first." Caleb looked toward the horizon, then said slowly, "Do you know what I remember about Mary, about your wife?" Mara asked. Caleb nodded. "She is 8 years younger than me. When we got married, everyone said she was too young, but she taught me patience. She saved me from the days when I lost everything in the war. She is young but strong as someone who has passed through many generations." Mara was silent. Caleb continued, "Age doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't measure courage, it doesn't measure empathy, and it doesn't measure how deep a person sees." Mara felt her eyes sting slightly. "And me, what kind of person do you think I am?" Caleb turned to look at her, the evening light reflecting in his amber eyes. "I think he said you are someone everyone has to look twice at." Mara's heart beat slightly. At that moment the wind blew across the steppe, carrying the smell of dry grass and the warmth of the earth. Mara felt a strange calm in her heart, as if the morning's fear had melted away with the wind. When they returned to the livery, the sky was dark. Before parting, Caleb said something that made Mara's heart sink and then warm. "Don't let a stranger make you doubt yourself. This land, and I, see you better than that." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a promise of marriage, but it was enough to mend some of the fragile wound that had been torn apart today. And that night, Mara slept better than any other night. 3 days had passed since the stormy evening. The town of Dry Creek Ridge seemed as calm as ever, but within the calm, Mara felt herself entering a new emotional zone, not too clear, not too safe, but enough to make her heart lean toward something she dared not name. That morning, as the sun was just peeking over the low hills, Caleb handed Mara a low wooden chair and a thick blanket. "It's cold today. Sitting in the livery for too long can give you back pain," he said. Mara laughed. "You're paying close attention." Caleb turned away slightly, but Mara saw the corner of his mouth twitch ever so slightly, a rare smile, small as a crack of light filtering through old wood. Around noon, Evan Boone rode into the livery carrying a small box tied with hemp rope. "My father told me to bring this to Aunt Mara," he said, jumping to the ground so fast he almost missed. Caleb and Mara both moved closer. "What is it?" Mara asked. "Pumpkin pie," he said proudly. "My dad made it last night. He said, you deserved some." Mara opened the box. A small, plain cake, fragrant with cinnamon, lay inside. The warmth lingered at the bottom. She paused for a few seconds, not because of the cake, but because of the significance of its presence. In the West, a widower sending someone food is not an arbitrary act. Caleb glanced at Mara, then at Evan, his eyes flashing with something hard to describe. Not jealousy, but as if he realized the winds had shifted in a direction he had no control over. But he said nothing. He just went back to his work, quieter than usual. After Evan left, Mara sat down on the chair and silently nibbled on the cake. The taste of pumpkin, cinnamon, and brown sugar spread on her tongue, sweet and light, like the scent of a kitchen she hadn't been to in a long time. She said softly, "The cake is really delicious." Caleb was retying the reins, but his hand stopped mid-stitch. "Silas can cook?" he asked, his voice emotionless. "He made it because Evan liked it," Mara replied. He said it was something his ex-wife taught him. Caleb didn't look at her, but his shoulders stiffened slightly. Perhaps he was remembering Mary. Perhaps Silas's story was taking him back to his own past. The room became quiet, not a heavy silence, but the kind that held things unsaid. In the afternoon, Nora Tillman stopped by the livery to ask Caleb to deliver some boxes of fabric to the shop the next morning. When she saw Mara stacking hay, Nora called back. "Mara, would you come with me for a moment? I need you to try on some new fabric samples." Caleb glanced at her but didn't object. Mara followed Nora back to the shop. On the way, Nora suddenly said in a low voice, "Little girl, do you know that many people are noticing you?" Mara was startled. "I don't think so. Dry Creek Ridge is small, but the men here are not blind," Nora said, half joking. "Silas is a lady, obviously. And Caleb, you know that without me saying it." Mara's face heated up, but she didn't speak. Nora smiled, then put a hand on her shoulder. "Don't be afraid. Everyone has the right to love again, even those who have been hurt." The statement made Mara pause for a second. Not because it embarrassed her, but because it hit home, exactly what she had been avoiding for weeks. To be loved again, or dare to love again, she wasn't sure she was ready. When they returned to the livery, Caleb was leaning against a wooden post, a saddle towel in his hand. He looked up, his gaze unchanged, but Mara sensed something deeper beneath the calm. "You're back," he said. "I'll help Mrs. Nora with something." Caleb nodded slightly. No questions, no request for explanation. But his eyes followed her as she passed. It wasn't a possessive look. It wasn't a curious look. It was the look of someone getting used to someone's presence, and finding that presence more important than he'd intended. That evening, as the sky turned a deep blue, Mara decided to stay on the livery porch instead of going straight into her room. Caleb emerged a moment later as if he was used to finding her in that old wooden corner. He sat down next to her, keeping a comfortable distance. "What do you want to say?" he asked, without beating around the bush. Mara was silent for a moment. "Mr. Caleb, if people said something bad about me, would you think differently?" Caleb turned to look at her, his gray eyes gleaming like steel in the firelight. "I think with my eyes, not with other people's mouths. But—" "Did you notice Silas's cake?" Caleb let out a breath. Not long, not heavy, but enough to let Mara know he'd been thinking about it. "Silas is a good man. But Evan is the reason he opened up to you," Caleb said. "He trusts you, and Silas knows it." Mara pursed her lips. "What about you? What is your reason?" She paused, unable to finish. Caleb propped his elbows on his knees, looking out at the night field. "I don't know, but I know I want you to stay." Those words were as light as a breeze, but to Mara they were as strong as thunder in his heart. She didn't know how to respond, partly because she didn't want to misunderstand him, partly because she was afraid of getting it right. A light night breeze blew, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp earth. Mara hugged her arms to keep warm. Caleb noticed and handed her his coat. "Put it on. I'm not that cold." "Put it on," he repeated, as low but firm as the sound of a door latch closing. She took it. When she put it on, she could feel his gentle warmth still lingering in the fabric. It was a very strange feeling. It was as if, in that moment, the outside world faded away, leaving only her and the silent man beside her. After a long while, Caleb stood up. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." As he walked away, Mara suddenly called out to him, "Mr. Caleb." He stopped but did not turn back. "Thank you for still seeing me." Caleb stood there for a long time. Then he replied, his voice low like the wind against the wooden walls. "You're easy to see, Mara." He left, and that night, for the first time, Mara felt her heart light up like a small fire knot, bright, not hurried, but warm and lasting. A small faith was sprouting. A slight change was happening in him. Something was slowly healing in her. No one called its name, but they both heard its voice growing louder. Late autumn days in Dry Creek Ridge passed more slowly. A chill wind from Eagle Crest crept down the dirt roads, crept in through the cracks in the doors, and made a faint murmur like a sigh of the season. Mara felt the change when she stepped out of her room the next morning. The sky was darker than usual, gray clouds thick as wool across the sky, but the air smelled of new earth, a smell that promised rain even if only a light drizzle. Mara pulled her scarf closer around her neck and stepped into the livery. Caleb was standing in front of Midnight's stable. His voice was soft and low, the way he spoke to horses when trying to calm them. When he saw Mara enter, he stopped and turned back. "Can you sleep?" he asked. "Okay. What about you?" "I don't sleep much," Caleb replied, but the corners of his eyes weren't as heavy as they had been the other day. "You look more awake today." Mara smiled slightly. I'm getting used to the pace of life here." Caleb said nothing more, but his eyes said it all. He was glad of it, even if it was only a slight nod. The morning passed peacefully until a man ran into the livery in a hurry. His face was red and he was breathing heavily. "Caleb, did you see Mr. Johnson pass by here?" Caleb put down his toothbrush. "No. What's wrong? He left early this morning. You know his illness. His hands and feet are shaking. If he walks too far, he could fall." The man sighed, then said, "I heard he was going towards Hope Ridge." Caleb and Mara exchanged worried looks. Hope Ridge wasn't as dangerous as the canyon, but the ground was soft and full of roots, making it easy to slip, especially for an old man with shaky hands. Mara felt an immediate pang of anxiety. "Mr. Caleb," she said softly, "we should go find him." Caleb nodded immediately. No discussion, no deliberation. His decisions were always quick when it came to the safety of others. As we headed up Hope Ridge, the wind picked up, shaking the birch trees. The sky darkened even before noon. "I hope he doesn't go too far," Mara said, looking around at the bushes along the road. "Mr. Johnson is not as lucid as he used to be," Caleb replied. "Sometimes he doesn't know where he's going." After going a little more than half a mile, they came across an old woolen scarf caught in a thorny branch. Mara recognized it at once. "This is Mr. Johnson's handkerchief," she said. "I saw him wearing it at church." Caleb bent down to examine the ground. Old boot prints were scattered across the soft earth. "He kept going this way," said Caleb. Mara followed, eyes straining for further signs. The air was getting colder. The wind blew her hair forward, obscuring her vision. But she kept walking. Not out of pure worry, but because she understood what it felt like to be alone. Mr. Johnson always went to church alone, sitting in the back pew, staring down at his shaking hands. People like that can easily disappear into silence. At last they found Mr. Johnson sitting under a large oak tree. He tried to stand up, but his left foot seemed to slip, so he sat down again, his face pale with cold and with that panic which old men are so bad at concealing. "Mr. Johnson." Mara ran over and knelt down beside him. "Are you all right? I just came out here to pick some herbs," the old man said, his voice trembling. "Then I slipped, and I can't get up." Caleb lifted the old man onto his shoulders, surprisingly gentle for someone of his size. "Your hands are cold," Caleb said quickly. "Let's go home." Mara took off her shawl and draped it over Mr. Johnson's shoulders. The old man looked up at her for a long time, then said in a choked voice, "You are the girl, people say." Mara felt her throat tighten. She thought the next words would stab her again. But the old man smiled weakly, his eyes dim but kind. "The girl has a better heart than they say." That sentence made Mara suddenly feel so warm that she choked. Caleb also looked at Mr. Johnson, for a sec surprised, but pleased. Then he began to lead the old man down the hill. On the way home, a light drizzle fell. The drops were thin but cold, soaking into her clothes and creeping through her hair. Mara stayed close to Caleb to help support Mr. Johnson, even though Caleb was carrying the heaviest load. "You don't have to try so hard," Caleb said softly. "I didn't try to. I just felt the need to." Caleb glanced at her, saying nothing more, but his eyes held a deep respect, the kind reserved for someone who did the right thing without expecting recognition. When they got Mr. Johnson home, his wife Olivia burst into tears of worry. She reached out to grab Caleb's hand, then Mara's. "Thank you both. Thank you very much." Mara felt a hug around her shoulders. It had been a long time since she had felt an older person's arms around her arms, filled with gratitude, no judgment, no pretension. On the way out of the cottage, Caleb walked beside Mara, his hand instinctively brushing her back to shield her from the dust from the dirt road. A natural, unplanned gesture. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Mara replied, but her voice was softer than ever. "Mr. Johnson reminds me of my father." Caleb stopped walking for a moment. "You love your father very much, don't you?" Mara nodded slowly, not looking at him. "He was all I had. When he died, I thought I would never feel like I belonged again." Caleb looked across the hill of Hope Ridge, where raindrops lingered on the young oak leaves. "Maybe you haven't come to the right place," he said. "The wrong person." Mara turned to him. His gaze did not flinch. It did not rush. But it was so genuine that it made her heart stop. "And now?" she asked very softly. Caleb didn't answer right away. He reached up to adjust the scarf that had slipped off her shoulders, a simple but thoughtful gesture. "Now, perhaps you are closer to the mark," he said. Those words, few flourishes, were enough to warm the darkness in Mara's heart. Mara returned to her room in a strange mood that evening. She sat on the edge of her bed looking out the window where the sunset cast soft orange streaks on the ground like honey. She thought of Mr. Johnson, of his loneliness, of Olivia's grateful eyes, and of the way Caleb had looked at her, no pity, no hesitation, no reserve. A man who lost the one he loved the most can still let light into his heart. And she, a girl who was once rejected, was finally seen by someone for who she really was. It's not magic. It's opening up slow, careful, but true to the core. She knew big things were coming. Turning points she dared not name. Emotions that were quietly growing day by day. And when she gently placed her hand on her chest, she knew something was beating differently. No more fear, no more just hope. But it is attachment, light as a breeze, but strong enough to change the course of life. The next morning the gray clouds had parted, revealing a pale blue sky like a freshly shaken sheet. Dry Creek Ridge was bathed in a soft, clear light, not harsh, but bright enough to reveal every speck of dust floating in the wind. Mara stepped out of her room, gently pulling back her thin shawl and looking around the livery. Caleb was working on a horseshoe, his back slightly tilted forward, his posture familiar and silent as always. When he looked up and saw her, his eyes softened, a softness that was hard to notice unless you were really looking. "You can sleep a little longer," he said. "I'd like to help you," Mara replied. "And I find myself wanting to start the day earlier." Caleb nodded slightly. There was no further praise or recognition, but the nod alone was enough to make Mara feel truly acknowledged. They had been working together for about an hour when the sound of wooden wheels echoed from the front gate. A strange cart pulled up, its wheels caked with dried mud from somewhere far beyond Dry Creek Ridge. The man in it got out tall, thin, in a faded old coat, his face gaunt and his eyes tired and strained. Mara had never seen him before. Caleb stood up immediately, squinting as if trying to remember. The stranger touched the brim of his hat, looked closely at Caleb, and said in a hoarse voice, "Caleb Ward." "Right." Caleb did not reply immediately. The air around him seemed to thicken. Finally he said, "You are Hank Doyle." The man nodded. Mara's eyes shifted between the two, noticing something rising like a sudden change in direction of the wind. "A long time ago," Caleb said. "Years ago," Hank replied. "I came about Mary." The name fell like a cold wind through the courtyard. Mara froze. Caleb's face didn't change much, but his shoulders tensed reflexively. Hank glanced at Mara for a moment, as if just noticing her presence. "You are the livery," Caleb answered immediately, his voice firm, not letting Hank steer the conversation in any other direction. Mara bowed to the stranger, but his eyes were still appraising. She sensed it and the tension deep inside Caleb. Hank turned to face Caleb. "I have to talk to you. It's important." Caleb looked at Mara. His eyes were hesitant for the first time, as if he didn't want her to hear what was about to be said, but also didn't want her to think he was keeping secrets. "Let's go inside," he said to Hank. "Mara, can you help me check the harnesses in the east barn?" His voice was soft, but the implication was clear. Mara nodded. She understood he wanted to keep her out of the conversation, but before she left, she glanced at him for a second. He looked back, a wordless look, but one filled with trust. Then she turned away. As Mara stood in the east barn, she heard men talking, words unclear, but Hank's voice was low, then harsh and irritated. Caleb's was even and deep. Mari didn't try to eavesdrop. She knew it was a story of the past, about Caleb and the woman who had been his wife. Every time she heard Mary's name, her heart ached slightly, not because of jealousy, but because of respect, and because she knew that the man still carried a layer of pain that had yet to be expressed in words. A long while later, footsteps sounded behind. Mara turned to see Hank standing there, his eyes deep and tired. "Are you new here?" he asked. Mara nodded, keeping her composure. "So you don't know anything about Mary," Hank said, his voice not hostile but haunted. Mara didn't know what he wanted, but she replied softly, "I only know that Mary is the person Caleb loves very much." Hank laughed, a dry laugh. "Love? Yes, he loves her. But sometimes, love can't save an unbalanced person." Mara felt a chill down her spine. "Mary died not because Caleb wasn't good enough," Hank continued, looking straight at her, "but because she was carrying too much sadness before she met him." Mara clenched his fists. He didn't mean it unkindly, but his tone was like someone trying to put a memory back into place. "She's my sister," Hank said, his voice softening a little. "And I came to give Caleb the last letter Mary wrote." Mara froze slightly. "One last letter, one last memory. He just won't read it," Hank continued. "Maybe he needs someone to push him." Just then Caleb appeared behind Hank. He stood still, as if he had heard enough to understand. "Hank," Caleb said, "don't drag Mara into our business." Hank turned back, his eyes filled with concern. "I just want her to know. You're still carrying a pain you shouldn't be carrying anymore." Caleb clenched his jaw. A gust of wind blew through, making the door bang lightly against the wall. "Okay," said Caleb. "Give me the letter." Hank pulled out a crumpled envelope from his pocket, its wax seal cracked. Caleb took it with a trembling hand. The sight made Mara's heart sink, for these fragments of the past seemed heavier than anything in the present. Hank put on his hat and got into the car. Before leaving, he looked at Mara one more time. "You are like Mary in one way," he said. "You can see through the loneliness of others." With that, he left the livery, the wheels leaving behind dust that faded in the wind. When they were alone, Mara looked at the envelope in Caleb's hand, saw the struggle in his eyes. He did not open it right away. He stood there for a long time, as if the object in his hand was not paper but an old wound that had not yet healed. Mara took a step forward, not touching him, just standing beside him. "If you don't want to read it now," she said softly, "that's okay. Not everything in the past needs to be opened." Caleb turned back to look at her a long time. "I'm not afraid of the letter," he said softly. "I'm afraid it will say that I haven't done enough." Mara looked at him with the softest eyes. "You do what you can, and sometimes that is enough." Caleb lowered his eyes to the envelope. "You really think so?" "I think. Mary loves you, and a true lover does not blame." There was a long silence. Caleb closed his eyes and exhaled as if releasing a heavy rock. Then he opened the letter, not with anger, not with fear, but with the calm of one who is strong enough to face it. Mara didn't read the contents. She turned away, giving him his space. But when Caleb folded the letter, his eyes were red but not broken. He just said one sentence, "Thank you for standing next to me." Mara looked at him. For the first time she saw in his gray eyes not just sadness, but resurrection, and she knew this moment would change them both. After Hank Doyle left town, the livery was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as usual. It was like a stone dropped in a lake. The surface was smooth again, but the ripples on the bottom were still spreading. Mara walked to the side of the stable, stroking Midnight's mane, but her mind was on the man standing on the livery porch. Caleb still held the folded letter in his hand, but he hadn't put it away yet, as if he needed a few minutes to catch his breath like himself. Mara didn't want to be a bother, but she sensed that he didn't need distance. She needed a gentle, unobtrusive presence. Finally, Caleb spoke first. "Are you scared?" he asked, his eyes still looking far away, as if asking someone invisible. Mara slowly approached, keeping a moderate distance. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of my past," Caleb replied, his voice low but calm. "Afraid of what comes with it." Mara looked at his hand that held the letter. The knuckles were hard and rough, but there was a slight tremor the first time she had seen it clearly. "I'm not afraid," she said. "The past isn't something we can choose, but how we live after it is." Caleb turned to look at her. His eyes were no longer guarded. They opened just a little, but enough for Mara to see the depth. "The letter," Caleb continued, "it didn't blame me. Mary just said she was tired, very tired. And, sorry she didn't show me all of it." His voice cracked slightly on the word tired, as if he had kept that word in his heart for years without being able to name it. Mara said softly, "Her sadness is not your fault. Sometimes people carry something that even love cannot touch." Caleb looked down at the ground. After a long moment he admitted, "I kept thinking I was to blame, that if only I had seen it sooner, things would have been different." "You imagine the best that could happen," Mara said. "But the truth is, we never know everything that's inside the person we love." Caleb sighed. Not the heavy sigh of someone falling, but the sigh of someone finally letting go of a weight they'd carried for too long. They sat down on the wooden steps in front of the livery. The wind picked up a little. It was cold. Mara pulled her scarf closer around her neck. Caleb placed the letter on his knee, his hand beside it, close enough that Mara's hand would have to move just a little to touch it. But she didn't, because she knew sometimes the closest thing to intimacy lies in a very small but respectful distance. Caleb spoke after a long while. "Mary is someone who sees things others miss. She is quiet a lot. Like you." Mara shook her head slightly. "I am not like her," she said. "I have never had such tenderness." Caleb looked at her, really looked this time. She was as strong as the stone of the West, but not cold stone. She had a tenacity that Mary lacked. She stood through things that should have knocked people down. Mara felt a lump form in her throat. Not from the comparison, but because for the first time he was calling her out for what he saw. No more dodging, no more half-heartedness, no more silence. As the afternoon wore on, the town of Dry Creek Ridge grew busier. A few people stopped by the livery, watching Caleb and Mara talk. Not with malicious curiosity, but as if they were trying to understand the relationship between the two. Hank Doyle's appearance, his loud voice, his annoyed face, all of it made this a hot topic. Mara caught a few glances. They weren't as judgmental as before, but they were still calculating, like people were watching to see what was brewing in the livery. She bowed her head slightly, not out of embarrassment, but because she didn't want to attract attention. Caleb recognized it immediately. He stood thought for a few seconds, then reached for the large wooden bar and pulled the livery door halfway shut. A small action, but enough to block out the gazes from the street. "You don't need to put up with those looks," he said. Mara smiled slightly, a grateful smile. "I'm used to it." Caleb shook his head. "But you shouldn't get used to it." The sentence made Mara freeze for a few seconds. It was a simple statement, but it carried the way Caleb looked at her, the way he didn't want her to suffer any more injustice. Not because he pitied her, but because he respected her. Late in the afternoon, Silas Boone stopped by to thank them again for helping Mr. Johnson. Evan came along carrying a small bag. "I brought you some walnuts," Evan said. "My dad said you like snacks." Mara laughed. "Thank you." Caleb looked at Silas. There was an uneasy understanding between the two men. Both had lost someone they loved. Both were trying to find a way to move on. And both looked to Marh in a different way. There is no rivalry. There is no competition. There is only an understanding that every broken person knows the value of a listening soul. Silas said to Caleb, "I heard about the strange visitor this morning." "What did he say to you?" Caleb simply replied. "Old story." Silas nodded slightly. "It's good to have someone to talk to." Caleb didn't argue, but his eyes flickered to Mara enough for Silas to see and understand something Caleb hadn't yet fully grasped. The old man put his hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You deserve some relief, Caleb." Caleb was silent. Silas said no more. It was dark. A chill wind blew down from Eaglecrest into town, rattling the livery. Mara lit an oil lamp in the room, its amber light spilling across the rough wooden walls. She sat down on the bed, remembering Caleb reading the letter, remembering the slight tremor in his voice, remembering the way his eyes closed and opened with rare relief. She put her hand on her chest. Part of her heart wanted to move closer to him. Another part was afraid she was going too fast. Someone like Caleb, quiet, deep, carrying old wounds, requires a patience not everyone has. She wondered if she had that patience, but then she remembered the way he placed his coat over her shoulders, the way he stood to shield her from strangers, the way he said, "I want you to stay." These things don't need to be taught, they only come from the sincere, and she knew. She could learn to breathe with his slowness, no rush, no pressure. Just take it day by day, step by step with him until they were both strong enough to move into the rest of their lives. Outside, the wind blew through the livery roof, making a soft sound like the sound of a choked guitar. Mara closed her eyes, letting her breathing steady. Not because she was tired, but because her heart had just realized something it had been touching for a long time, but was only now calling it by its proper name. The first days of winter came quietly to Dry Creek Ridge. There were no blizzards, no thunder and lightning. Just cold mornings, dewdrops on the fences, and the breath of white horses rising in wisps of smoke. The town seemed to move slower. And in that slowness, things were quietly changing. One of them was Caleb. No one saw the change more clearly than Mara. Caleb didn't talk much anymore. He didn't smile much anymore. But his silence was different. It was no longer a wall that no one could pass through. It was like a warm room, the door slightly ajar so that the person standing on the threshold could feel the warmth inside. And Mara Somahow was the one who walked to that door. One morning, as Mara was folding the horse blankets, Caleb stepped beside her and placed a pair of soft, dark brown leather gloves on her hands. "Put it on," he said. Mara was surprised. "For me, your hands get redder every day from the cold. I don't want you to get numb while working." She slipped her hands into the gloves. They fit well, warm and soft enough that she knew Caleb had chosen them carefully. "Thank you," Mara said softly. Caleb nodded. "If you're cold, just say so." A short sentence, but it contains something that not all sweet words can carry, unobtrusive but deep-rooted concern. That afternoon Silas came by. Evan ran into the livery as usual, but this time he did not jump on the horse right away. He carried a small piece of wood. "I made this for you," Evan said, holding out a piece of wood clumsily carved with the words, "Thank you, Mara." Evan smiled, his eyes shining in the sunset. "I know you don't like too much attention, but I still want to do it." Mara gave the boy a gentle hug on the shoulder. "I like it. Thank you very much." Caleb stood a few paces away, watching them with a strange softness in his eyes. Perhaps he was getting used to seeing Mara find a place among people she had once been apart from. Getting used to her, not just remaining in the livery, but in the hearts of more people than he had ever thought possible. Silas approached Caleb. "You look relieved," Silas said. Caleb didn't reply, just let out a long sigh. "I read Mary's letter," he said. "She forgave me, but perhaps the person I haven't forgiven is myself." Silas put his hand on his friend's shoulder. "You don't have to blame yourself anymore. Anyone who has loved deeply is trapped in memory." Caleb looked over at Mara, who was helping Evan tie his shoelaces, her smile as light as the last remaining sunlight. "She helped me remember how to breathe," Caleb said. Silas smiled, unsurprised. "I know." That evening, after everyone had gone home, the livery was bathed in the light of a single oil lamp. Mara swept the wooden floor before entering the room. Caleb stood near the door, as if waiting for her without even realizing it. "Have you ever read the letter?" he asked, so surprised that Mara paused. "A letter from my father," she said slowly, "before he died." Caleb tilted his head. "What did he say?" Mara looked down at her hands. "He apologized for leaving me alone too soon. Then, he told me I had to move on. No matter how much it hurt, I had to keep going." Caleb was silent, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the words touched a familiar place. "You did it," he said. "You kept going, alone, and still kind." Mara took a deep breath, then said, "Not alone anymore." Caleb looked at her closely, the look of someone who didn't want to misunderstand something important. "Mara, what are you talking about?" She took a step forward, didn't touch him, didn't ask him to change, just said one sentence very softly, "I am no longer afraid to stay." Caleb stood motionless, as if he was listening to every word she said with all his heart. The oil lamp flickered slightly, the amber light illuminating his face, revealing something no one had seen since Mary's death, a raw tenderness. He spoke slowly but clearly. I am no longer afraid to let you stay by my side. No flowery confessions, no tight hugs. Just two people standing before each other, leaving behind the wounds that had accompanied them for so long. And that was powerful enough to change the rest of my life. A few days later, the town gathered at the church for a belated Thanksgiving. Children ran around the yard, adults passed out freshly baked pies. Mara stood beside Silas and Evan when Caleb arrived. He looked at her, his eyes quiet, calm, but so warm that her heart felt like it was shrinking. Silas laughed loudly. The two of you standing next to each other look compatible. Evan nodded vigorously. I told you it was right for Miss Mara to stay here, the whole town heard. Laughter broke out everywhere. Mara blushed but didn't take her eyes off Caleb. Caleb tilted his head and whispered so only she could hear. If you want to leave, I will take you. But if you want to stay, I will do everything to give you a place to belong. Mara replied softly, I have chosen. The evening wind blew through, carrying the scent of pumpkin pie, pine wood, and cold earth, typical of the West. Caleb held out his hand. Mara placed her hand on his, a quiet but sure action, like a wordless promise. And in that moment, Dry Creek Ridge was no longer a strange town, no longer a place where she was seen as a reject, no longer a temporary stop. It becomes home, not because of the place, but because of the person standing next to her, the person who had reopened the door to her heart after many years of silence. A slow love, quiet, but strong enough to withstand all prejudices and the coming winters. A love that makes old hurts find a place to melt away, and new hopes find soil to sprout. Mara and Caleb's story reminds us of something simple yet profound. Every heart has wounds, but also the ability to heal when the right person at the right moment meets us. At 60 and beyond, we understand more clearly than anyone else that life is not always gentle. Everyone has pain that no one sees, loss that no one counts. But this story shows that sometimes a look of understanding, a word as gentle as the wind, or just the presence of someone who knows how to listen, is enough to make us strong again. No one is too late to be loved. No one is too old to start over. And no one is so lonely that a hand cannot touch their heart. Thank you for listening to this story in its entirety. If you find the warmth of Mara and Caleb's journey meaningful to you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to spread more stories of healing power.